Hi and welcome back to Philosophy with Phil, with me, Phil Cohen. For this video, I wanted to talk about reality and religion, but in a very different context, and taking it off in a whole new different direction. The reason being is this would have started out as a typical talk about religion versus science, but to be honest with you, there's lots of good books and shirim and talks and YouTube videos about how the two, whether or not the two are compatible. This book particularly, if you are interested in the subject, I would definitely recommend, by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Covers it in an incredible amount of detail, very thorough. Can be a bit hard going at times, I have to admit. There's not all of it that I agree with. I think some of it goes off on a bit of a tangent, but nonetheless, a thoroughly good treatment of the subject, in my opinion. But the truth is, in Judaism, the Jewish writings, particularly the Gemara, writes about other things as well, not just science, but I guess you would include maths and medicine as well in that, but history as well. So I didn't just want to restrict myself to just talking about science here. I'm talking about generally how religion, what we do when what the Rabbonim are telling us conflicts in some way with what we know through our studies of human knowledge or reality or whatever it is you want to call it. And the story starts for me a couple of years ago when our rabbi at the time, Rabbi Shimshon Silkin, wanted to give a shir on Shavuos, on Pentecost, on the subject of smoking on Yom Tov. Whether one could smoke on Yom Tov, smoke cigarettes on Yom Tov. And I remember saying to him at the time, you know, it's a little bit niche, a little bit specialist, not sure it was going to be an attention grabber, not sure everyone's going to be thoroughly interested by this. And he said, don't worry, there's more to it than just what you think. So we went ahead, and here's how it started. It went through the sources of Rabbonim that showed what their thinking was as to why and how one can smoke on Yom Tov, and there are ways of doing it, and it's okay. Please consult with a rabbi if it's something that's relevant to you. And then he went through other sources that were saying not only is it allowed, but there were Rabbonim that were saying it was positively to be encouraged. Smoking was something that gave people pleasure, and Yom Tov is a day, a chag, a day of enjoyment, a festival, a time to celebrate. And so, smoking is something that we should be encouraged to do. Now, let's not forget, when these Rabbonim were writing what they were writing, not only was smoking something that everyone did, but doctors themselves were also positively advocating smoking as a way of cleaning out the lungs and killing out all the toxins and the bugs and everything that we were breathing in. Little did they know that as well as killing out all the bugs, the cigarette smoke also kills out a load of other things as well, and does a tremendous amount of damage to people's health. And now, as I say, most doctors, in fact, pretty much all doctors would say smoking is bad for health. So the technology, the science has changed, but we still have those rabbinic authorities that say, yes, smoking is okay. And in principle, we've gone through this before in the talk about culture. We're very reticent to let go of a halachic opinion. So what do we do about those rabbinic opinions that said that smoking was okay? None of them mention the dangers of smoking. So what do we say? Do we say that they were reliant on the science of the time, and they were being advised by medical advisors or scientists or biologists or whatever it was, and those people were telling them that smoking is okay, so they went ahead and gave their ruling? Or do we say no, they were in tap with a higher spiritual revelation that we can only vaguely imagine, but that was temporarily masked at the time, or whatever it was? They didn't feel they could go against the tide of current opinion. How do we reconcile one with the other? Do we say that these are people that are solely basing their pasak, their ruling, on the prevalent science of the time? Or do we say, no, they are on? It's not for us to question what they say? And, as I've said, you can see how we're going to pull in what's relevant to us is the talk that I gave on culture and how we establish Jewish law. So the two questions I want to ask are like this. One, if we have a law that is based on an assumption, be it a historical assumption, a cultural assumption, a scientific assumption, or whatever it is, and that assumption subsequently changes, or knowledge of that assumption subsequently changes, do we then change the law? Okay, so in the case of smoking, clearly that has happened. We'll come on to other examples other than smoking very soon. But the one has to say, one has to be careful about how definitive we are in changing the law. And question number two is, in the Talmud, and I guess elsewhere as well, we are given general knowledge, and as I say, I've broadened it out to be knowledge or reality. It's historical facts that are given, medical advice is given, mathematical calculations are made, and we know them to be either inaccurate or just no longer relevant. What do we do about those things? Do we say they're irrelevant now? Do we can it? Do we learn it? Do we consider it on the same level as other things that are more relevant? What do we do? I'll start by saying that this is going to be a little bit of a mishmash, and I guess to some extent this is still a little bit of work in progress, so I'm hoping maybe I might come back to this video. The Rambam Maimonides, in various places in his commentary on the Mishnah, differentiates between halacha, Jewish law, and machshava, if you like, Jewish thoughts, Jewish philosophy. And he says that whilst we must take what the Rabbanim write about halacha as definitive, as something that applies today, the philosophical ideas that aren't relevant, that don't make a difference to our day-to-day lives as much, are things that are subject to the times. To give you a quote from his commentary on the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, chapter 10, Mishnah 3, or similar thing is written in his commentary to Mishnah Sota, chapter 3, verse 5. Translation here: we've already mentioned to you many times that with regard to any argument between the sages which does not involve practice, rather it's talking about philosophy, there is no room to render a final ruling that the halacha is like one of them. Okay, so we can't divine a halachic psak from a philosophical discussion, basically. Let's start with the easy one. We are familiar with the dissonance, or the difference, I guess, between reality and what happens in a court case. We have unfortunately come across situations of miscarriage of justice, where the police may suspect someone of doing something, but they just can't get the evidence together to convict them. It's not to say that that person isn't guilty, and when it comes to a trial by court of law, the court of law is unable to find them guilty. That doesn't mean they're innocent, but it just means that there just wasn't enough evidence. Okay, so we're familiar, that I would hope is a fairly standard difference. Okay, an example of that in Jewish law, again to do with a Jewish course of law, is that the Jewish calendar is set by the Beis Din, and it's based on the lunar cycle. Okay, based on the lunar cycle. But there are times we have specific rules under which we can shorten or lengthen a month. For example, the new moon that's coming up for Tishrei Rosh Chodesh, or better known to all of us as Rosh Hashanah, actually occurs on Saturday night, not Sunday night as we're celebrating it this year. In fact, for the last 2 years, I think it is, a similar circumstance has happened, and we've had to postpone Rosh Hashanah. We've extended Elul by a day. Not a lot of people notice it, but we've added in an extra day to the calendar. Now, there are specific rules about why the Beis Din has had to do it, and that's why Batei Din across the world have all unanimously agreed on what they're going to do. One of the reasons is that we don't want Yom Kippur to fall out on a Friday or a Sunday. We don't want 2 days when we're celebrating a very strict festival. Shabbos and Yom Kippur next to each other. So we're familiar with the idea then that what is reality, i.e. the new moon should be celebrated on, Rosh Hashanah should be celebrated on Saturday night, isn't necessarily what we actually go ahead and do. And as I say, a Beis Din can only go by the rules that they are set. And if they are set rules that say they are only able to convict someone based on the evidence in front of them, then they have to go ahead and follow those rules. What about, so that's one area where the actual reality is different from what we actually go and follow. But what about the situation we were talking about earlier with smoking on Yom Tov? What do we do when the reality, or what we know about human knowledge and science, changes? So, like I say, we've spoken about smoking. Just to give 2 or 3 other examples, and I'm afraid they're a bit biological. It used to be, and this is the way I learned when I was studying physiology at uni. We learned that the hormones that a woman expresses when she's lactating, when she's breastfeeding after giving birth, switch off her menstrual cycle. That way the woman is conserving fluid, and it's better for her health, and make sure that the baby gets the nutrition that the baby needs. But what we've found more recently, after the last 10, 20, certainly since the 20 years, certainly since the war, is that because we live in times of relative affluence, that is no longer necessary, and women are able to resume their menstrual cycle, or do have their menstrual cycles resumed whilst they are breastfeeding at the same time. There's hormonal reasons why that is able to happen, and so on, but that we do find that. And as a result, because of various marital laws that apply to a woman that are relative to her menstrual cycle, that has implications to when a woman goes to the mikveh, and how she resumes relationships with her husband after giving birth. Okay. So we have, and it's very well documented that we have now halachic changes in halacha that have occurred, as I say, in the last sort of 20, 30 years or so. Another example is the laws of treifas. When an animal is slaughtered for Jewish meat, for kosher meat, it is examined to see if there are signs of a malady, an ailment, an illness, a wound that would have killed that animal anyway, within a certain period of time. Some say 30 days, some say a year. Anyway. But there are, and such a malady, for lack of a better word, is called treifas, and that's why we now use the word treif to describe meat that is not kosher, or it's been extended to mean anything that's not kosher. But that's the technical halachic definition of what a treifas is. It's something that would kill that animal anyway. And if we find something like that, then the animal is considered treif and it cannot be eaten. Now, the lists of wounds and ailments that are given in the times of the Gemara and the early halachic sources are now, with the aid of medical science and veterinary science, are no longer as life-threatening as they once were. And the Chazon Ish, for example, was one halachic authority, a recent halachic authority, acknowledges that what was life-threatening back then is no longer so. And some of these trephus signs that we are warned to look out for, sort of 1,000, 2,000 years ago, are no longer relevant. Number 3, or 4, I guess. There is an underlying, this is more of a sociological assumption. There is an underlying principle in Jewish matrimonial law that women are better off being married. Now, in today's society, we would see that as being misogynistic, sexist, whatever you want to call it, and unfair to women. And believe me, I know 2 or 3 families where the woman is the breadwinner of the family. She's the one that's the active one that goes out and earns more of the money. The husband works, but he's the one that's more of a house husband and works part-time, looks after the kids. Okay, this happens. But in the times of the Talmud, that wasn't the case. And a woman's absolute A1 priority, the minute she hit puberty, was getting married getting a good match and being looked after, and that was the one thing that preoccupied her father. Okay, we know that, and that has underlined a lot of halachic thinking with regards to things like the aguna. That's the situation where a woman is in a marriage and she wants to get out of the marriage, and the husband won't consent to a get. What we have to ask is, now as I say, we have the emancipation of women, the suffragettes and all of that sort of thing. What do we say about this principle? Does it still apply? Can we discard it now? Is it fair to keep women into apply this logic to marriage just because that's the way it was all those years ago? Okay. Far be it from the discussion of that is way above my pay grade. And has preoccupied many dayanim and leading halachic authorities since I can remember. Anyway, for a long, long time. So I'm not going to get into that. What all of this does, though, is assumes that I've said that we have assumptions that the Rabbonim give, or reasons that they give for a mitzvah or an edict, and that assumption or rationale falls away, and then we have to decide whether we keep hold of that edict if it was dependent on that logic, that rationale. Now, on the one hand, we have people like Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. So in him, major leading halachic authority on in the sort of 1970s and 80s, died in the early 80s. Him in his introduction to his masterpiece, Igros Moshe, says that when a rabbi gives a pasuk, he can only go based on the facts that are given before him, and we have to take what he says in context as a result of that. So we have that on the one hand, but that kind of implies that if the logic falls away, like with the smoking, if the technology, the science changes, that we are in a position to be able to rewrite that ruling. Okay. I think personally, there's a balance to be had here, and I think there's a danger of chasing after rationales for mitzvahs and digging too deeply, and ignoring the depth of the outcome. Okay, yes, there are things that are ruled in context, cultural context, historical context, or whatever, geographical context, and other pressures on the rabbi at the time. But I think one has to be careful about nullifying a ruling altogether And as I say, I would definitely not say that's something that a layperson could ordinarily do. The next question I wanted to address was talking about knowledge or facts or reality, I guess, in the Torah and the Torah literature and the rabbinic literature. And what do we do when something that we read conflicts with other information that we have, knowledge that we have, be it from science, from maths, or from medicine, or whatever it is, or history. Let me give an example of something that I have to be honest with you, I struggle with. As an example from the Chumash, from the Torah, and then we'll go on to talking about the Talmud. So it seems like quite a straightforward story. I'm in Genesis, in Bereshis. I'm in chapter 30, verse 23. And we're talking about Rachel giving birth to a son, to her first son, Joseph. Okay. And the Torah says that she gave birth to a boy. V'tomer Asov Elokim es cherposi. God has brought in my disgrace. V'tikra shemo Yosef lemor Yosef Hashem li bein acher. So she called his name Joseph, and saying, "May Hashem add for me another son." Now, what Rashi says on this is peculiar. What is this disgrace that the Torah is talking about? Rashi says straightforwardly, as Rashi does, he gives a straightforward explanation, and then perhaps if he thinks that's inadequate, he'll give a supplementary, if you like. He says the disgrace was that she hadn't given birth for so long. Leah was giving birth. Leah had given birth to I can't remember how many it is by this point, but she'd eventually went on to give birth to 6 sons. Rachel, this was the first son that Rachel had given birth to. This was her disgrace. But he then goes on to give a more midrashic, agadic explanation. And he says like this: a woman makes mistakes. People make mistakes at home. And a pot gets broken, is the example he gives. When she's living on her own, it's her fault. The husband comes home from work, sees the broken pot, gets angry at her. But if there's a child, then she can blame the child. Now, I'm going to tie this up. This is going to drive you a little. This drives me a little bit in knots. Because on the one hand, we're talking about 2 of the greatest spiritual beings, human beings, that have ever lived: Jacob and Rachel, Yaakov and Rachel. The epitome of a marital of harmony and happiness in a Jewish marriage. Okay, Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. He has been steeped in the learning of his father Isaac. He has gone through so much to get to where he is. We all know all the fabulous stories about him that preceded this. To say that he would come home from work and get or from tending the flocks and get angry at his wife for a broken pot. Yes, I know pots were expensive in those times and they had little money and that was all they had. To me, sounds quite hard to swallow. The question one has to ask is, are we saying that they were these 2 immensely spiritual human beings? Or do we say, no, they were human beings nonetheless. They were subject to the foibles of a normal, regular marriage, and you know, he comes home from the fields, and sometimes he has a good day, and sometimes he has a bad day, and things happen in the home, and stuff gets broken. And yeah, okay, now she can blame the baby for what's happened, and it deflects his anger against her, because after all, no father is going to take out the anger on a little baby. Which one of those do we go with? Do we go with Jacob as a spiritual being, or Jacob as a normal, regular, flesh and blood human being? And the truth is, I don't know. And I come across these conflicts all the time when you're studying these stories, studying the Torah, these portions of the Torah. I've heard Rabbonim come out and say things like this. Yes, if it applies to Jacob, even more so it should apply to us. And the truth is, I don't know the answer. Lastly, I wanted to switch over to the Talmud, to the Gemara, where there are mathematical inaccuracies, particularly with regards to pi. There are medical cures that are given in the Talmud which we know no longer apply. There are chronologies, there are historical chronologies which we know to be inaccurate. And I think I have to leave with, end up with the Rabbi Maimonides in his Guide to Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, chapter 3, verse, portion 14. And this is a translation. You must, however, not expect that everything our sages say respecting astronomical matters should agree with observation. For mathematics were not fully developed in those days, and their statements were not based on the authority of the prophets, but on the knowledge which they either themselves possessed or derived from contemporary men of science. In other words, yes, the people in the Torah, the Rabbonim in the Gemara, were human beings. They were flesh and blood. They were subject to the foibles that we are all subject to. But yet, they reached such spiritual heights. We can aspire. We can get there. And it's not just something that we can pass off and say, that was then, this is now. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for watching.